Story 1. The 1980s Nostradamus documentary with Orson Welles could not even get basic historical facts correct. Story 2. Any Shark Week fans remember that false megalodon hunt they aired about 10 years ago? I haven't watched Shark Week since. Story 3. I am starting to have my doubts about this Blair Witch. On a serious note, Nanook of the North really kicked off the documentary movement as we know it today. It included many staged scenarios and false facts. Still, it is an important and interesting film that shows how long this issue has persisted in documentary form. At the very least, Robert J. Flaherty was quite open about his embellishments compared to some people mentioned in the comments. Story 4. The Curse of Oak Island. It has been 10 years. Will they ever find the treasure? Story 5. Super Size Me is the obligatory example. Morgan Spurlock conveniently left out the part about him being an alcoholic and a vegan when he started his experiment. Story 6. The Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui Way of Knowledge. A University of California, Los Angeles anthropology student travels to Mexico to study psychedelics. He meets a native medicine man and becomes his apprentice. This was during the 1960s and 1970s Chicano movement, when connection to native ancestry was popular, as was experimenting with psychedelics. The book was a popular success, and the author published a few sequels. All of it was false. He made it all up. Story 7. Alien Autopsy. While they never proved it to be real, they heavily implied it. One thing they did was show the video to special effects artists who said they could not recreate that amount of detail of the alien's inner organs. Turns out the person who faked it just used pig organs. Story 8. Several months ago, we watched a random Tubi program called Bigfoot vs. Yeti for a laugh. It was a silly debate about who would win. The problem is that one or two people at the beginning acknowledged these were fictional creatures, but every other interviewee presented their opinions as if they were facts. Statements like, "We know that Bigfoot is sensitive to sound. How do we know?" When I did not watch it with high expectations, but I was still disappointed by how it was presented as if these were established facts, when they were made-up opinions for 90 minutes. I suppose this is no different from much paranormal and extraterrestrial content. Many of these documentaries should have clear disclaimers running throughout because much of what they say is purely imaginative. Perhaps I am not desensitized enough and dislike things being presented as news or facts when they are not. Story 9. The Netflix special about Dennis Reynolds' ex-wife mysteriously dying. Dennis was forthright. Story 10. Any and all, finding shows like Finding Bigfoot have never once found anything. The format is story, cliffhanger, commercial, cliffhanger that turns out to be easily explained. Then the cycle repeats for 8 seasons. Story 11. The whole Ancient Aliens show on the History Channel was lies layered on top of misinformation, which was based on academic mistakes that had long been corrected before the show aired. However, the people who liked the narrative chose to keep using these errors as fact. None of it was true. Every single point they made in favor of ancient aliens existing has been thoroughly debunked. Story 12. Netflix's Cleopatra. Everything I have read states she was mostly Greek. Story 13. Live to 100. Secrets of the Blue Zones. Some of the blue zones they visited are no longer considered blue zones. There is no scientific research being conducted, only speculation based on data. Story 14. Der Science-Stat, also known as the Führer gives a city to the Jews. Nazi propaganda film shot in 1944 in a concentration camp that had been modified during production to give the impression that the Jewish people were living healthily and happily there. It is possibly one of the worst instances of cynicism by the Nazis. Story 15. Super Size Me tries to make out McDonald's is entirely to blame for his health issues. A doctor even says something along the lines of, "You've got the liver of an alcoholic." And he claims not to drink, so it must be the food causing it. However, it later emerged that he was in fact an alcoholic. There are many other issues with that documentary that make it very biased, but that was the part that stuck with me. Story 16. Finding Kendrick Johnson contains misinformation. It uses a report that clears the suspect as its only evidence and ignores that the report proves his alibi. Story 17. Nanook of the North is the first ever feature-length documentary. There was no precedent regarding ethics and truth, so the director staged most of what you see in the movie. Story 18: White Wilderness. Lemmings do not commit mass suicide and were not pushed off the cliff by crew members. Story 19. There is a Canadian documentary about two men who are released from jail. The supervisor of the trailer park where they live is against them for some reason. I think parts of it might be staged. Story 20. The one from a few years ago when they found Noah's Arkansas. It later proved to be a hoax. Story 21. Anything directed by or featuring former physician Andrew Wakefield. Vaxxed. From Covered Up to Catastrophe, April 2016. Vaxxed 2. The People's Truth, 2019 to 2020. Infertility. A Diabolical Truth, June 2022. Vaxxed 3. Authorized to Kill, September 2024. Story 22. Any of the documentaries shown in the 53 seasons of Documentary Now are questionable, either entirely or in part. Story 23. The Accident and Emergency documentary about Lacey Peterson. Scott literally murdered her, and he is too much of a psychopath to admit it. At least Chris Watts eventually confessed the true story. Story 24. Supersize Me. The man was a raging alcoholic the whole time. Story 25. Reefer Madness. It was shown to me in high school. What a joke. Nobody I knew believed that nonsense. That was the very beginning of my distrust in the government. Story 26. United Passions. United Passions is a 2014 English-language French drama film. It is about the origins of the world governing body of association football, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. 90% funded by the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. It stars Tim Roth, Gérard Depardieu, and Sam Neill, and is directed by Frederick Auberton. The film's United States release coincided with the 2015 Fédération Internationale de Football Association corruption case, in which several current and former members of the Fédération Internationale de Football Association's executive committee were arrested on charges of corruption. The corruption investigation led to the resignation of the Fédération Internationale de Football Association's president, Sepp Blatter, following decades of speculation and accusations of corruption under his leadership. The film was accused of ignoring these long-running claims. Tim Roth said that he asked the filmmakers, "Where's all the corruption in the script? Where's all the backstabbing, the deals?" He said he attempted to convey these elements through his performance, stating, "It was a tough one. I tried to slide in a sense of it as much as I could get in there." The film's director, Frederick Auberton, claimed he inserted ironic parts into the film. Story 27. The documentary about Megalodon being real. The documentary about mermaids being real, featuring the German fisherman who does not speak German. There was a similar one about dragons, but that one does not count in my opinion because they clearly say in the beginning that it is not real. Supersize Me. The problem was not so much McDonald's as it was the protagonist's drug abuse. Anything related to ancient aliens. Story 28. What do we know? For entertainment purposes, it is actually solid. The visual effects were pretty good for its time, kind of trippy. 10 out of 10, worth popping and edible and watching. However, the science was rather askew. They tried to make quantum mechanics into a new age self-help concept. Energy works on the quantum level, so if you think bad thoughts, your houseplants will die, or if you yell at water, it will not be as good for you when you drink it. I do not know. I am pretty sure at the root it is legitimate, but they just stretched it quite a bit. Story 29. Most people have probably forgotten about the movie. What the bleep do we know? You can basically thank this documentary for popularizing a variety of New Age ideas that led to the rise of pseudoscientific psychobabble, often promoted by personalities like Joe Rogan. Story 30. I don't know if it is considered a documentary, but Carol Baskins was unjustly treated in Tiger King. She is no saint, but she absolutely should not have been the most hated person in that show. Story 31. That Final Days of JFK Jr. special ABC aired a few years ago. I will not speak to what was going on in his personal life, but when they covered his accident, that was awful. According to the Federal Aviation Administration and National Transportation Safety Board investigations, JFK Jr. was an incompetent pilot. It is questionable whether he should have had his ratings at all, especially to be able to fly that day. He is the textbook example of poor decision-making as a pilot in the Federal Aviation Administration's own textbooks. ABC made extensive efforts to portray him as a victim, instead of the arrogant person who caused the deaths of two innocent people. Story 32. Zeitgeist was so well composed you'd think they surely must know what they are talking about. But even before any refutation, you should notice errors such as the Son of God equivocation. Story 33. Casey Anthony documentary. That lying, baby-killing, life-ruining, disgusting person. Story 34. Not exactly what you are asking, but those ghost hunting shows are completely staged. There is no way the Discovery Channel is paying for this haunted house expedition without any insurance. Story 35. Anything on Discovery, National Geographic, or History after the Murdoch takeover. Story 36. What the health? I watched it with my vegan university group, and it was easy to spot the disinformation. The film claimed that eating an egg a day is as bad for your life expectancy as smoking 5 cigarettes a day. This is completely false. Story 37. Supersize Me. The man was drinking the entire time off camera. Story 38. Blackfish. If even half of what they said was true, then the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, National Wildlife Rehabilitation Network, and Jack Hanna would have withdrawn their support from the parks. The people who made Blackfish delayed its release until the park had gone public on the stock market to undermine their new stock. They then used the proceeds from their documentary to open their own aquatic theme park with orcas on display in open sea pens. One of their biggest financial backers stated there was no evidence their approach was better. If they had known this was their intent, they would not have invested, because they believed SeaWorld properly cared for their animals. Story 39. Waiting for Superman was hailed as an important look into the ways that schools are funded in America and how the funding process is tied to their success. In the end, it used selectively chosen information and emotional appeals to justify voucher programs and charter schools, which misinformed the public about their school systems and contributed to the rise of people like Betsy DeVos. These talking points had existed in conservative think tanks for generations, but this documentary popularized the ideas among liberals, making them mainstream long enough to take root and harm the public school system in large areas of the country. It was Davis Guggenheim's follow-up to An Inconvenient Truth. The vast majority of studies have shown these points to be false. However, the publicity it generated at the time it did greatly benefited DeVos and her supporters. Story 40. Bowling for Columbine. I am a fan of Michael Moore. However, one of the major elements of his film implied that the two miscreants went bowling prior to the slaughter. They did not. Story 41. The radical story of Patricia Hearst. CNN interviewed her kidnappers, who completely controlled and lied about her time in captivity. One of them claimed she was in a relationship with one and had sex with different members. In reality, they raped her in turns because everyone was close and would share each other. Story 42. Supersize Me. All the health detriments Spurlock was experiencing were supposedly due to eating a diet of nothing but McDonald's for 30 days. It turns out he was a severe alcoholic undergoing liver failure. Story 43. Loose change, also known as one of the big catalysts of the belief that 9/11 was an inside job, caused a lot of commotion. Story 44. Didn't that McDonald's representative turn out to be a full-fledged alcoholic? Not to say McDonald's is healthy, but it is not exactly the greatest experiment. Story 45. Although Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth was absolutely necessary, as an environmental analytical chemist for 20 years, it opened the door for naysayers and anti-climate change skeptics. The picture of a rusted ship in a desert, which I recognized from an old general chemistry textbook, accompanied by Al Gore's voiceover stating, "When I flew over this area, it was apparent that climate change was indeed real," somewhat diminished the impact for me. Story 46. I remember watching something about polar bears starving and suffering because of humans. Maybe it was on Netflix. I was deeply impacted by it. Then, while searching on the internet, I found a video that completely dismantled the depressing documentary. It exposed it as blatant propaganda and, in short, a big lie. It was a mind-blowing realization. I was disturbed that the only scientist who knew what she was talking about was silenced, mistreated, and removed from the project for not supporting the false story. This happened some years ago. I was shocked to see such a shameless work of deception and mass manipulation exposed so thoroughly. Story 47. Zeitgeist. You can search all the claims yourself, and everything in that movie is false. The sad thing is, when it was released, I believed it. Story 48. Supersize Me. Multiple people have attempted to replicate the experiment. They never succeeded. The liver issues, in particular, seem to have been more related to the large amounts of alcohol that Spurlock was consuming. Story 49. Two old-school examples. Bowling for Columbine, while making some good points in my opinion, contains many twisted and falsified facts. That was the first documentary I recognized as unreliable. Loose Change, the September 11th documentary, relied on poorly edited and faked audio, video, and transcripts. People still believe it. Story 50. Does not exactly fit this mold, but the Cecil Hotel documentary basically ends up proving itself to be full of nonsense at the end when you realize how ineffective these internet investigators actually are in real life. The documentary would have been 5 minutes long if they had presented the evidence the actual police had from the very beginning of the story. Story 51. Supersize Me. Turns out that while McDonald's is not good for your health, neither is chronic alcoholism. Story 52. An Inconvenient Truth. I mean, what a bunch of fantastical nonsense, Mr. Gore. 18 years later, sorry, never mind, it checks out. Story 53. Seaspiracy comes to mind. They portrayed fishermen as the bad guys, but fishermen are the ones most critically invested in sustainable fishing and ensuring the longevity of fisheries. Story 54. The Secrets of the Dead episode. Abandoning the Titanic proposes that a cargo liner called the Mount Temple was in sight of Titanic the night she sank, saw her distress rockets, and ignored them. This essay explains why everything in the program is false. Story 55. A production labeled as a documentary does not guarantee credibility. It is frighteningly easy to present a false narrative by omitting information and sharing only what makes the preferred premise seem plausible. Coupled with an emotive story, people can be manipulated quite easily. Making a Murderer has been mentioned several times as a good example. Especially in criminal cases, it is essential for a film to honestly present the evidence and counterpoints from both sides. What we sometimes end up with instead are multiple one-sided films on the same issue conflicting with each other. What is disappointing is that even though it is common knowledge by now that many so-called documentaries lack integrity, there are still too many people who accept them without question. This is how you know the propaganda effort succeeded. Nothing should ever be above question or verification. Story 56. I remember when the documentary Plandemic was exposed almost immediately after its release and was pulled from YouTube within hours. I have seen it, and it is completely false. Story 57. Supersize Me. No one was ever able to replicate his results. Story 58. What the Health. This documentary promotes a vegan diet by linking meat and dairy consumption to a variety of diseases. Critics argue that it uses selective studies, misrepresents data, and exaggerates risks associated with animal products. Many health experts criticize it for its alarmist tone and factual inaccuracies, especially regarding claims about meat and diabetes. Story 59. 2000 Mules, created by Dinesh D'Souza, is a documentary filled with doctored evidence and false claims that the 2020 election was stolen. The distributor eventually removed it and issued an apology. If D'Souza produces it, it is likely to be nothing more than propaganda filled with lies. Story 60. Not full of nonsense, but a crude awakening. The oil crash from 2006 shows how difficult it is to turn data into an accurate projection of the future, and how we adapt to certain pressures in unexpected ways. Story 61. Loose Change. 9/11 Conspiracy. Pretty much everything in that has been debunked at this point. Story 62. Supersize Me. The person neglected to mention that he drank alcohol throughout the entire time he was on that diet, which affects the validity of his eating claims. The rest of the discussion about nutrition is not reliable. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.